Hello everyone, more Gear Lab time. This time a more generalised update as opposed to the previous one's French focus. We've got fast firing 16 inches, Japanese super fighters, super heavy shells and more. Obviously it's Gear Lab, you know the drill. Some exclusive higher end gear available as your reward for grinding Opsci. And a place to dump event exclusive gear when it gets archived. When they get around to updating it once or twice a year. Let's open up with the Royal Navy's twin 113mm quick-firing Mark V. These were late war guns aimed at addressing the shortcomings of Royal Navy DD guns, namely the lack of dual-purpose capabilities. These were fast-firing guns that made their debut on the Australian battle-class destroyers, with their first British use on the post-war Daring class, in spite of being planned for the multi-class carriers and late-war Lion redesigns. These were generally well regarded and served on many ship classes for many years after the fact, even though the power loading system was complex and temperamental, leading them to be hand-loaded sometimes. We're going to ignore that though, the same way the AL devs ignored the Spearfish being a piece of shit. This gun would be crafted from the existing Mark IV, or the new one they just announced, and feature improved rate of fire on par with the Blue Single 76. Though keeping the normal ammo type as not to completely outclass the existing Rainbow 100mm, which fires HE with better modifiers. The idea here is to give ships that rely on the aforementioned 76 a better high rate of fire gun to use. You guys like the Iowa gun? Stupid question, of course you do. But I feel like it's missing something. The 16-inch 50 cal, as capable as it was, could rival the Yamato guns, but only when combined with the super heavy shells. It feels kinda wrong to have one without the other, so let's fix that. This would be a variant that swaps its ammo type to super heavy AP. This is the same stuff from Massachusetts' 2,700 pounds of justice skill, with the same 65, 135, 115 armor modifiers and 20% armor break chance. Other than that, it's the same triple Mark 7 that we've had for 3 years at this point. Good lord, where does the time go? According to some French sources, the Aero Naval had an interest in the Arsenal VB-10. This was a heavy intercept fighter, being developed at the start of the war as one of those weird French twin-engine planes that looks like a Zingle, like the original SC-580. Work was put on hold during the war, with the exception to some testing on the tandem engine setup, but resumed late and post-war in a bid to restart the French aviation industry. Unfortunately, the prototypes kept catching fire and crashing. Also, jets were a thing now, so a new piston fighter with underpowered engines really had no place. It's unknown whether the Aero Naval's interest in the VB-10 was as a land-based fighter, or if there would have been a deck version too, so this one might be a bit egregious. Putting it in game, it would be the French equivalent to the F6F Hellcat, being a good 2x 500 pound fighter, with greater AA than most of the others thanks to its heavy armament. In this case, a 4x 20mm cannon and a 6x 12.7mm machine gun. Now for a weapon the Kriegsmarine probably wished they had at the start of the war. The twin 128mm KM40. These were navalised versions of the 61 caliber Flak 40 that would usually be mounted in static installations and flak towers, specifically the two-gun Flak Zweiling mount. These were considered one of the best heavy AA weapons of its era, but Hitler's decision to not introduce it, quote, during this war, end quote, resulted in a limited production run. A shipborne mount was under development, but progress was halted by the war's end. There was a number of shore-based naval installations though. In-game it's a gold variant as a heavy AA gun with greater damage and slower reload than the 105 counterpart, while also giving a small firepower increase at the cost of lower AA. Another DD gun, this time the American twin 127mm 54 Mark 16. These guns were designed as a longer barreled upgrade to the already excellent 5-inch 38 that it would replace. They would also fire a larger, heavier shell to further increase its capabilities. This tended to fatigue the crews faster though, which is probably why it never caught on, despite being a better version of an already great weapon. That and the original was good enough. These were intended for use as secondaries on the Montana-class battleships, as well as the main armament of the CL-154 AA cruisers, but would make their debut in single mounts on the Midway-class carriers following the cancellation of those projects. They'd also show up on some late 50s Japanese DDs. These aren't too complicated when it comes to theory crafting their addition into Azo Lane. They were straight upgrades of the 38 cal in real life, and they will be in game too. A good general purpose DD gun, in contrast with the fast 100mm Kai and the slower damage heavy Mogador guns. Japan's up next with the elusive Mitsubishi A8M Rikufu. Late into World War II, the IJN were looking into new high-altitude fighters to deal with all the B-29s that were burning Japan cities to the ground. Eventually, this led to the decision to begin work on a new generation fighter, jointly developed by Mitsubishi and Nakajima, to replace the A7M, though ironically would use the updated A7M3J as a base. Doubly so when you consider the A7M didn't make it to service. The general characteristics was a carrier fighter with general improvements in all areas over the A7M, featuring a new Nakajima engine and heavier propeller, whatever that means. Much like in real life, its in-game version will be the same. The ultimate Japanese fighter with exceptional AA, armed with a new Tier 0 version of the 4x20mm Type 9, and upgrading the two 500-pound bombs to Tier 0 as well. The Italian single 65mm 44 Model 1939 is up next. A medium caliber AA gun intended for the Capitani Romani cruisers/destroyers, Etna class cruisers and Aquila. Initially intended as an automatic weapon, this caused problems with the time fuse setter, so it was reverted to hand loading. Compared to the existing single 90mm, it would have a greater rate of fire in exchange for reduced damage, and as previously alluded to, it would be a time fused gun. Oh, by the way, did you know the 135s from the Capitani Romani class had a triple version, used as secondaries on the rebuilt Andrea Doria battleships? I propose putting them in game, having the same damage and fire rate as the twin, but with 6 shots instead of 4. Like a SAP version of the Mogador gun. Also, putting triples on a destroyer was funny. Time for another variant. This time, the Blackburn Firebrand TF Mark V. This was the final version of the Firebrand, fully transitioned from a naval interceptor cousin of the Hawker Tempest to a competent carrier strike aircraft with an unfairly tarnished reputation. They served an important role in defence of the home islands. While the Sea-Fires and Furies were gallivanting around Korea, the Firebrand stayed home to act as defence against a growing Soviet fleet should the Cold War go hot. The later Marks added dive brakes and strengthened the wings to handle up to 2,000-pound bombs. So that's what this variant is. A gold dive bomber armed with a pair of 2,000-pounders. Everything else will be the same as existing Firebrand. For the Northern Parliament is the triple 356mm 52 Patton 1913. These were meant to arm the ill-fated Borodino class battlecruisers, with the production of the gun split between the British Vickers and Russian Obukhovsky steel plant. A total of 17 guns were built, and despite the ships they were meant to arm being canned, they stuck around for a while, with plans to use them in coastal defence batteries or on a monitor using whatever was left over. In the end, about half a dozen were used as railroad artillery in batteries at Leningrad and the Far East. These are essentially just here to bridge the gap between the blue triple 305s and the gold triple 406s when the Russians get their tech tree. Another older gun is the French 90mm 50 caliber MLE 1926. These were anti-aircraft guns mounted in either single or twin mounts on a number of French ships. They equipped the Suffren class, minus Suffren herself, Emile Bertin, the La Galissonieri class, as well as being emergency AA for John Bart. This would be another lower rarity gun for when the French Gear Lab gets heavy caliber AA, or as default equipment for the later Suffren class. Here's a surprise: some German carrier aircraft. In 1938, the German Air Ministry issued a requirement for the Arado and Feisler aircraft companies for a fast multi-role carrier aircraft, intended to replace the R195, R197 and Phi 167. Obviously with German carriers being, they didn't get very far, not even receiving proper designations. And there's not a whole lot known yet either. But that means I get to take some creative liberties. I am choosing to pull from both to plug a few holes in Ironblood's aircraft lineup. The Araldo design, E310, will be a gold fighter, with the same cannon armament as the PF-109G carrier-based prototype, while also carrying a pair of 1,000 pound bombs. Ironblood is in desperate need of a fighter with ordnance. One of the Faisler designs, P-22, on the other hand, will be Ironblood's first gold dive bomber, with an ordnance load of 1 2,000 pound and 4 100 pound bombs, plus a 2x20mm MG151 and a 2x13mm for the cannons. The final gun in this video is the Royal Navy's triple 406mm breech-loading 16-inch Mark II, the Lion class's guns, and the last big guns the Royal Navy would ever design. These largely resembled upscaled 356-45s from the King George V class, and similarly were designed for accuracy and consistent muzzle velocities over raw ballistic performance. One particular thing to note about these, and all Royal Navy BB guns of the era, was the particularly high bursting charge of their AP. Compared to the US Super Heavy shells, these had 8.5 kilograms, roughly 18.6 pounds, more explosive filler. When they punched through, they hurt. Gameplay wise, they'd be an AP equivalent to the Gold Nelson gun, with basically identical stats. However, we can take these further, as during and after the war, development would continue with the Mark IV prototype. These were to fire slightly longer and heavier, not quite super heavy, projectiles. But what really set them apart was the new Mark III mounting. That would optimistically use a single ramming stroke to load the propellant, allowing for a 3 rounds per minute rate of fire. For comparison, a 9-gun line with these guns would put out more shells per minute than a 12-gun Montana. Translating this to AL, this would be broadly the same as the Mark II, minus the increase in firepower stat, now firing the AP plus ammunition, and having a similar reload rate to twin guns despite being a triple. To end us out, a double dose of flying freedom, the Boeing XF-8B and the Martin AM Mauler. By May 1943, the US was in the market for a long-range fighter to take the fight to the Japanese mainlands, and Boeing was awarded the contract. But they had bigger ambitions. They were going to make a plane that could do it all, a 5-in-1 fighter that could be a fighter, interceptor, level bomber, dive bomber, and torpedo bomber based on what the mission called for. Not a bad plan considering how crowded American flat tops were becoming. A lot of different planes that needed different replacement parts and different trading. The end result was a very capable plane that didn't really excel. It could carry almost 3 tons of bombs but was somewhat unstable in a dive. It was fast and could carry 6 20mm cannon, but also remained the largest single-engine piston fighter the US ever built and was heavy. In 1946, the Navy put out a contract for as many as 600 machines, but Boeing was too busy building transports and bombers to take them up on it. In Arsenal, this would be a multi-role capable of passive intercepts, like the Wyvern. This one, however, would be a dive bomber that carries a single 2,000 pound and 2 1,600 pound bombs, crafted from the Gold Helldiver and or BTD destroyer. The AM Mauler was a different beast. Another late war superprop with prototypes ordered in 1944 as a multi-purpose bomber. It was ordered as an unexperimental backup to a complex Curtiss design the Navy had learned from the Helldiver. Prototypes were rapidly developed, and in early 1945 the Navy ordered 750, though this was later revised down to 99 following Japan's surrender. Just as well they did, even after a redesign in 1947, Able Mabel was starting to look a lot more like an awful monster. The Mauler was a beast. It could carry more payload in weight and numbers than the Sky Raider, as shown in this photograph of it carrying 3 torpedoes and a dozen 250 pound bombs, plus its fully loaded cannons. That's a combined weight of about 4.8 tons, that's impressive. And yet, the Sky Raider was the one that stuck around because it just kinda worked, while the Mauler really didn't. It was heavy to handle, struggled to keep formation, was difficult to land, and if you're less than perfect, liable to bounce off the deck over the wires and into a crash barrier. To top it all off, it was just a pig to maintain. By 1950 they were relegated to shore bases, and a few years later unceremoniously pushed out of service. The AL interpretation will be based on that massive payload I showed earlier. A torpedo bomber carrying 3 torps and several small bombs. In this case 100-pounders though, as Arzelane doesn't have 250s. And down to half a dozen instead of the full 12 for balancing purposes. And there we go. Another hypothetical update to the Gear Lab. To be honest, a load of these could be event shop gear, but those end up in the lab eventually, so really it's the same thing, it just takes a few years. It's a little biased towards higher tier equipment, but the nature of the Gear Lab forces that. No one is grinding OPSI for Gear Lab materials so they can make equipment that's outclassed by what they already have. As usual, leave any thoughts on my suggestions or your own suggestions below. I may not reply much, but I do read them. And until next time, fair winds and following seas.